Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into the history of children's rights.
Ooh, that's a big one.
Yeah, it is. And we're using this really fascinating article from 1978 called
What's it called?
Salvation versus Liberation. Catchy, right. It's all about how ideas about children's rights kind of took shape.
Especially in the US.
Right, especially in the U.S. during a time of major social change.
Like a turning point. So
Exactly.
are we talking like 60s, 70s?
Yeah, that era. But the article doesn't just jump into the 70s. It actually takes us back to the turn of the 20th century.
Oh, wow. So like setting the scene.
Yeah, the U.S. was industrializing rapidly. What comes to mind when you think about children in that era?
I mean, factories, right? Child labor.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Uh,
Kids working long hours in dangerous conditions, missing out on education.
Basically a completely different world.
Totally. And it was this situation that sparked a movement of reformers, people like Jane Addams, pushing for change.
They were like, hold on, this isn't right.
Exactly. They pushed for child labor laws, mandatory education, even the creation of juvenile courts.
Huge steps forward.
Right. It seems like clear progress. But the article's title, Salvation versus Liberation, hints that things weren't so simple.
I was just going to say there's got to be more to it.
There is. By the 60s and 70s, people started questioning this whole idea of protection. Was it always in the best interest of the child?
Or was it sometimes a way to control them, limit their freedom?
That's the tension the article explores.
Makes you think of the women's rights movement, too.
Totally. Women were protected for generations, but it often meant being excluded from opportunities.
Exactly. So who are the big voices in this debate over children's rights?
Well, the article mentions Bruce Hafen and Robert Levy, who argued that children need protection and guidance from adults.
The classic parents know best argument.
Right. They believe that granting children too much autonomy could actually put them at risk.
Makes sense, but what about the other side?
You had thinkers like John Holt, who believed in almost total self-determination for children.
Whoa, really? Like kids making all their own decisions?
He argued for kids having the right to work, vote, choose where they lived. Basically the same rights as adults.
That's a pretty radical stance.
It was, and it sparked some heated discussions. One example is the debate around a child's right to education.
Everyone agrees kids should have an education, right?
Right, but there was disagreement on what that education should look like. Advocates like Marian Wright Edelman emphasized access to quality education as a fundamental right.
So like making sure schools are good and accessible to all.
Exactly. But liberationists questioned the structure of traditional schooling.
Did they think schools were too strict? Too authoritarian?
Yeah, they argued that traditional schools didn't respect a child's individual needs and interests.
So even within the movement for children's rights, there were different visions.
Lots of different ideas about what was best for kids. And then you had the added layer of the government's role.
Oh, yeah. How did people view the government in all of this?
Well, you had the backdrop of the civil rights movement and protests against the Vietnam War.
People were questioning authority in general.
Exactly. And that skepticism extended to how people view the government's role in children's lives. Were schools truly serving kids? Was the juvenile justice system fair?
So this distrust of institutions, it was impacting everything.
It was a time of questioning everything.
Did the article mention any specific criticisms?
Oh, yeah. People argue that schools were failing to teach basic skills and that there was racial bias in testing.
It sounds like people were starting to see that the systems weren't perfect, even the ones designed to help kids.
Yeah. And that realization led to some pretty complex dilemmas. How do you balance protecting children with respecting their autonomy? Who gets to decide what's best for a child?
Really tough questions.
And we're just scratching the surface here. In part 2, we'll dive into how the UN Declaration of the Rights of the Child influenced the debate in the U.S.
That'll be interesting.
We'll also look at how specific events and legal cases shaped the movement for children's rights.
Can't wait to unpack all of that.
So make sure to join us for part 2 of this deep dive.
It's going to be good.
All right, so we're back, diving deeper into this history of children's rights.
And we left off talking about distrust in institutions, like were they really working for kids?
Exactly, and right in the middle of all that, you had this UN Declaration of the Rights of the Child, adopted in 1959.
Oh yeah, the UN stepping in.
What do they actually say kids should have a right to?
Well, it's a whole bunch of things, but like the core stuff, education, healthcare, protection from exploitation, all the basics.
Sounds pretty important, but did it actually change anything in the U.S.? Like, it's the UN, right?
Good point. And that's what's interesting. The article talks about that. The declaration wasn't legally binding. So no way to really enforce it?
So more like setting goals.
Yeah,
Rough.
exactly. Like an ideal to work towards, even if reality was kind of messy.
But it still had an impact.
Oh, yeah, huge symbolic impact. Put children's rights on the world stage. Gave advocates something to point to.
So it's like, even if it wasn't law, it gave them leverage?
Exactly. And especially in the US, with all the social movements happening, it fit right in.
People were already fighting for equality and justice.
And then this declaration comes along. It's like, hey, kids deserve those things too.
Right, like it gave them a framework to talk about children's rights in a way that resonated with everything else going on.
Absolutely. It was a powerful moment. And, it actually led to some concrete progress, especially in juvenile
Oh
justice.
yeah, how so?
Well, people started realizing treating kids like mini adults in the legal system, just not right.
Their brains aren't even fully developed yet.
Exactly. And that led to some big legal wins, like the Galt case in '67. It said kids have the right to due process, lawyers, all that, even in juvenile court.
So even if juvenile courts are supposed to be more about helping than punishing, kids still have rights.
Exactly. In this case, it shows how the movement was working on two levels, like changing laws, A&D, changing how people thought about kids.
The two-pronged approach.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there were different voices even within the movement.
Right. We talked about the liberationists, who wanted total freedom for kids, and the advocates, who focused on specific rights.
But it wasn't that simple, right? Lots of shades of gray.
Totally. The article points out there wasn't one unified movement, more like a bunch of people with different ideas, all working towards similar goals.
Like a big, messy tapestry.
Yeah, but that was actually a good thing. Meant they could address all sorts of different issues.
Makes sense. If it was too rigid, might have pushed people away.
Exactly. And that open approach, it's something we can learn from today, right? Children's rights are still complex.
For sure. And one thing that really stuck with me, the article calls children a minority group.
A minority group.
Yeah, like think about it. Kids are often denied basic rights just because of their age, like other minority groups.
So it's not about their choices, it's just who they are.
Exactly. And this lens, it helps us see how kids have been marginalized, their voices ignored.
Like when adults make decisions for their own good without even asking them.
Exactly. And the article talks about that, how protection can be used to control kids, silence them.
So it's like protection is important, but it can't be an excuse to shut kids out.
Absolutely. And that tension between protection and liberation, it's at the heart of this whole movement.
How do we protect kids without taking away their freedom?
Big question. No easy answers, but I think recognizing that power imbalance between adults and kids is crucial.
Like constantly checking ourselves. Are we truly doing what's best for them or just imposing our own ideas?
Right. Got to be humble, listen to kids, be willing to change our minds.
So it's not just about protecting them from the world, but protecting their right to, like, shape their own experience of the world.
Beautifully put. And that's where empowerment comes in, not just giving them rights on paper, but helping them actually use those rights.
Give them a voice, not speaking for them.
Exactly. And education is key here.
Not just the ABCs, but teaching them to think critically, to understand their rights.
Yeah, give them the tools to navigate the world, to advocate for themselves.
So it's about moving from vulnerability to possibility.
I love that. And it's happening. There are so many amazing young people out there making a difference.
It's true. We often underestimate how much kids can do.
We need to celebrate their contributions, their passion, their energy.
Absolutely. So in part 3, what does the article say about the long-term impact of all of this? Like, where did it lead?
I'm curious too. We've talked about the challenges, but what about the opportunities? What's changed?
Yeah, what about the laws? How do we make sure kids' rights are actually protected?
Big questions, and I think the answers might surprise you.
All right, well, we're going to get into all of that in part 3, so stick around. Okay, so here we are, the final part of our deep dive.
It's been a wild ride, right?
It really has. From factories to, like, global declarations, it's amazing how much has changed.
And how much is still changing. But as we wrap this up, I keep thinking about that phrase, salvation versus liberation.
Yeah, it really gets to the core of this whole thing, doesn't it?
Like, we want to protect kids,
Keep
obviously.
them safe. Right, but we also have to recognize that they're not just, like, passive little beings. They have their own ideas.
Their own desires, their own dreams.
And sometimes those things clash with what adults think is best.
And that's the dilemma, isn't it? Where's the balance? How much freedom is too much?
It's a question that comes up all the time. education,
Yeah.
healthcare, even online privacy.
It's everywhere.
Yeah, like how much do we control and how much do we let them figure out on their own?
And I think this article, it shows us that it's not a new question. This tension between protecting and letting go, it's been there all along.
Like even those early reforms, the ones that helped kids, they could also be kind of stifling.
Right. Good intentions, but sometimes they went too far.
So it's this constant back and forth,
Yeah.
trying to find that sweet spot.
And there's no easy answer. It's different for every kid, every situation.
But one thing's for sure, we have to acknowledge that power difference.
Oh, absolutely. We're the adults, we make the rules.
And kids, they're kind of at our mercy.
That's why that minority group idea is so powerful. It makes you see it in a new way.
Like we have to be super careful not to abuse that power.
Be aware of our biases, make sure we're listening to them, not just talking at them.
Giving them a real voice, not just lip service.
Exactly. And that brings us back to empowerment.
Giving kids the tools to speak up for themselves, to fight for what they believe in.
And education, that's a huge part of it. Not just filling their heads with facts, but teaching them how to think.
To analyze, to question,
Yeah.
to make their own decisions.
Yeah, to be active participants in their own lives, not just going along with whatever adults say.
And, it's happening. We see young people all over the world standing up, speaking out.
It's so inspiring.
It really is. Makes you realize that maybe we don't give them enough credit.
They have so much to offer, so much energy, so much passion.
It gives you hope for the future.
It does. And it makes all this work, all these conversations feel worthwhile.
Like we're part of something bigger.
Exactly. It's not just history. It's about building a better world for them.
A world where every kid has the chance to thrive.
And that's a goal worth fighting for, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into the history of children's rights.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. It's been a pleasure.
And until next time, keep those conversations going, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep fighting for a better future for all children.